Dr. David Lowe was only able to join us on Wednesday at this time. So I'll make a quick introduction. Dr. David Lowe is currently an assistant professor at California University in Fresno. And all of his work, in recent work, has to do with the inclusion of graphic novels and comics in the teaching of language arts. I think you had a chance to read some of his work. I'm not going to say any more. I want to make sure to leave Dave all the time to tell us his experiences and his knowledge and everything you can share with us in terms of how to use comics and graphic novels to teach languages. So Dave, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I apologize that we had technological issues that prevented us from starting on time. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to be joining you in Medellin today. I'd like to start with a question for anyone who'd like to answer it. What are some of your experiences reading Graphica in schools when you were growing up? Did you read Graphica in schools? Did anybody? I'm seeing some no. I'd like to try to better understand some of the context around comics in Colombia. My experience, both as a child in the United States and someone who taught in the United States, is that comics are not generally given a lot of respect. Children might bring them to school and have them confiscated by a teacher, sometimes thrown out at the end of the day. But in the last 10 or so years, the medium has begun to get some traction in school libraries and consequently in classrooms. So it's finally getting a little bit more respect here. And I'm curious, is that something that you're seeing in Medellin as well? Do people read? What are some of your experiences?
Anyone? Well, they're unusually shy today for some reason. Maybe because it's Wednesday.
That's okay.
No, but I can tell you from the work we're doing, I think the culture of comics is emerging. We have there's more interest in comics and graphic novels. We have seen the emergence of more like comic bookshops and like comic events. Like now we have our own local version of Comic-Con that's happening in 2 cities.
Okay.
But I think the question about incorporating comics into the class, it's still in its infancy.
Yeah, okay. So similar then in our two countries' contexts. Now, in the comic book stores that are popping up in Colombia, are these mostly American comic book characters, you know, Batman and Spider-Man? Okay, so not Colombian characters or creators. The reason I like all of this is that looking at comics and school and literacy together requires us as educators to say, well, who gets to define what counts as literacy? Because traditionally we have teachers and principals, administrators who would say there are good books. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, good author. Comic books, bad. We don't let kids read that in school. And so by even having this conversation, what we're doing to a degree is saying children have a right to determine the literature that matters to them and the text that matter to them, whether that's manga from Japan or a Spider-Man comic book or the Black Panther movie or the new Avengers film or the cartoons that come out of it. Just by even thinking that maybe there's something to be found there, we're doing the work of critical educators. We're thinking in terms of power. We're thinking about who has the right and the responsibility to define what literacy even means. And that's a pretty big step. I mean, that's a step that a lot of our ancestors in education possibly haven't taken. The ones who maintain a rigid hierarchy of these texts are good and children need to be assigned them, and everything else is bad. So I'm curious then, if we're the sorts of educators, everyone in this room, that would like to honor and respect the textual choices of children, of young people, how do comic books play a role in that? And that's what my work has been now for about the last 10 years. I worked with a group of children and teenagers in a city called Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is very racially segregated. I'm not sure how aware you are of the context of schools in the United States, but in many of our big cities, we're more racially segregated now than we were 40 years ago. There are schools where white children go and schools where children of color attend. And Philadelphia is one of those cities that, I mean, it's glaring. You walk into different schools and you see, very different kinds of contexts. So I was working in one of these schools in Philadelphia, and a lot of the students kept telling me, like, we want comic books. We know that kids in other schools get to read comics, but we're not allowed to do that here. And I talked to their teachers, and their teachers had very traditional feelings about comic books. It's junk. It's like, I wouldn't let my child eat candy for dinner. Why would I let my students read comic books in class? Sort of mentality. So subsequently, the children, most of them children of color, many of whom were immigrants to the United States from Central America, Southeast Asia, started using comic books kind of as a way to tell their experiences, and to relate to characters that they knew that their teachers didn't care a whole lot about. So I'll give an example. The school that I taught at, the children were not encouraged to talk about race and racism and sex and sexism, but they used comic books, which they knew their teachers thought were just kind of junk, to have these really deep conversations around sexism and racism, knowing that they were going to get away with it because their teachers thought, oh, they're just talking about Spider-Man. What could really be there? I don't know if anyone sees Spider-Man on my wall back there, but this is the new movie that talks a lot about race and language and racism. So it's in some ways a really perfect vehicle for young people to be able to have deep, critical conversations, even when teachers aren't paying attention to it. So that's been a little bit of my work, is thinking about, like, what are the affordances of pop culture and texts that combine images and words that allow young people to kind of develop critical identities, critical consciousness. Are these terms that are familiar to you? Things like critical consciousness from Paulo Freire? Have you read that yet, Raul?
No, they haven't. Can you explain it? Can you elaborate?
Yeah. So just anything you need me to elaborate on, just let me know. So, critical consciousness, the idea that everyone is an intellectual and has the ability to sort of look at contexts or texts and peel back the layers of them, to look at, like, what are the ideologies behind them? Are texts that are being assigned in school containing hidden messages about the patriarchy or white supremacy? And in American schools, oftentimes the texts that have been assigned to readers are ones that are written by white men and contain lots of messages about who in society should act and who should be acted upon. And so the idea of critical consciousness then is that we're able to read texts kind of against the grain and pick them apart and ideally write a more just and equitable world in the process of doing that. So the fact that, like, we can look at comic books as being tools of this kind of work, I think in some ways is pretty groundbreaking, because they've always been, in America, sort of disrespected as being junk. And so to say, oh, you can actually use comics to ask kids to talk about gender and sexuality and Marxism and patriarchy and some really deep and bothersome topics. I don't, it keeps me excited to be working with kids, especially because right now, every kid that I get to know loves superheroes. They're like, do you guys spend a lot of time in schools with children yet? Maybe you will soon as part of your education, but I enter a school now and like literally within 3 minutes, I overhear one child having a conversation with another child about superheroes. Oh, do you think Batman could beat up the Hulk? And then that conversation extends into, oh, but what about that time that the Hulk did this? Did you see that? And then that conversation extends into, well, have you seen this movie? Have you seen that movie? And I'm just blown away by how many children in the year 2019 seem to derive a lot of their identities and their textual preferences from these this shared Marvel universe. I hear children that have never been to Africa talking about Wakanda and what Wakanda's politics would mean on a geopolitical scale. And I find that very, very exciting that, you know, kids are talking about colonialism, but they're using Black Panther and Wakanda and Marvel Comics to do this kind of work for them. And it's so exciting. So I'd like to kind of open the floor to any questions or concerns that you might have early on. I see a hand, and I like your shirt, by the way. That's really cool.
So, can you just come a little closer to the microphone? So just, by the way, just to keep sense of sequence, when you introduce yourselves and then ask a question. So this can just give it, so David, yeah, ready? So they can see you. And yeah, there you go.
Okay. My name is Carolina.
Hi.
Hi. How can we encourage these conversations, these critical conversations in our ESL students? Because sometimes language, the lack of vocabulary, for example, is a barrier we deal with. So they do have opinions and something to say, but they don't know how to.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think one of the real wonderful affordances of using comics to do this is that I'm assuming that you're talking about using comics that are written in English. Is that right? Or written in Spanish? Either way.
Both.
Both. So in comics, the actual language only carries some of the meaning. Like we get a lot of the meaning on the page through the illustrations and how characters are rendered. And so I've done a lot of work actually with children from Guatemala and Mexico who some of them are just learning English for the first time. Others have been in the process for maybe 3 or 4 years, but they do a lot of critical reading of these texts by looking at the way bodies are positioned on the page. So, you know, if they want to talk about something like sexism or racism, you need only to look at the images to see how are women portrayed. I mean, do they speak or do they just stand on the margins of the page wearing bathing suits, essentially? Are they presented as strong? You know, when there's a team of Avengers or X-Men who are fighting a villain, is it the men who are doing the fighting while the women kind of, you know, pose like this in the background? And then similarly with issues of race and representation, I'm sure you know the term marginalized. To be marginalized, when you look at a comic book, that becomes a literal thing. Like, who appears at the center and who appears at the margins? And oftentimes, with American comics, it's white characters and male characters who appear at the center of the page, and then characters of color are literally pushed to the margins. And that's changing because movies like Black Panther made over $1 billion worldwide. I think the people who make these texts are starting to say, well, we don't need to relegate our characters to these minority positions, these marginalized positions. But these are the kinds of conversations that I think you can have with any child in any language regardless of whether they are actually able to read the words that are in the book, these things are jumping out from the images. And one of the things that I've done with a group of newcomer immigrant families to Philadelphia, this was a program where students came from over 20 countries and spoke 15 languages. And so not only could I not communicate directly with all of them, but they couldn't communicate with each other. But we were able to do some really cool things using wordless comic books, like comic books that only used images and had no words in them. And so at night before we met as a class, I would make photocopies of pages from these books and then take scissors and cut them up. And then I would ask the students to rearrange the panels in any way that they wanted to tell a narrative. And then they used English and their home languages to explain why they put these images in the sequence that they did. So I definitely would, I recommend finding some wordless comic books to use with language learners, and not just English language learners, but anyone who's learning any language as an additional language, because it's a really interesting exercise to have to put things in a new sequence and explain why they make sense that way. So thank you for your question. And again, I love your t-shirt. Who are we going to call? Any questions? And I love that there's such an emphasis on teaching speakers of other languages in Medellin. This is something that I'll ask Raul about in a few weeks when I see him in Toronto, just because I'm curious how the contexts are different.
Oh, I would love to talk about that, definitely.
Yeah.
Any other question for David? Be shy.
It's okay. I'm shy too a lot of the time.
What about video games? Do they work as well?
Absolutely. So I find that a lot of the children who love comic books are also children who love video games, and they don't see them as two separate things a lot of the time. You know, it's all just part of a larger universe of things that they love that their schools don't let them do, which, you know, causes this in-school versus out-of-school mentality where you say, I go to school so I can read books that I don't like, and then I go home where I get to play my games and read my comics. So I think both of them, Graphica and games, give us tremendous real estate for doing this kind of critical work. Both of the industries that make comic books and make video games have traditionally been very sexist. And I think because of that, they give young people a buy-in to try to say, how can we improve this? If there have been people who are left out of these things, how can we try to open up spaces? So have you heard of this thing called Gamergate?
Yeah.
So Gamergate was this, basically women who worked in the video game industry were targeted on social media by men who thought that women should have no place in the industry. And then there was another thing called Comicsgate where women who work in the comics industry were attacked by similar men. And so, you know, a lot of them ended up leaving social media, and several of them have actually left the industry. But it's caused the industries to hold up a mirror to themselves and to say, you know, like, is this who we are? And is this who we want to be? A small group of sniveling white men who are trying to keep everybody else from participating. So I think because of their shared histories, yeah, video games and comics actually go hand in hand for doing this kind of critical work. And I really recommend the work of one of Dr. Mora's and my colleagues in literacy. His name is James G. G-E-E is his last name. And he writes books on what video games can teach us about literacy, and really interesting. So I want to see like a show of hands in the audience. Who in the audience considers yourself a gamer, even a little bit? Okay, so maybe like a third of you. And one of the best metaphors that I've seen about video games and teaching is that when we're designing a curriculum or a lesson that we want to teach with children, what if we thought the way a video game designer thought? Because the way a game designer designs a level is it has to be challenging enough to make us want to keep playing it, but it can't be so difficult that we give up. And like, yeah, that's a pretty good metaphor for what a lesson plan should do with children. We want it to be challenging but not impossible. It should, I can't imagine if my growing up and taking mathematics courses felt like that, I probably wouldn't have hated math so much. But usually it felt like an impossible video game that I just couldn't beat. And so, you know, you give up after a while. And video game designers are testing their games before they release them. They'll watch hundreds of people play them and see, are too many people, you know, dying at this point of the level? If so, we need to make it easier. If not enough people are dying, we need to make it harder. And it's very similar to what teachers do in the classroom on the fly. You're constantly watching students and saying, is this too difficult? Is this too easy? What kinds of changes do I need to make? So there's actually some parallels between game design and just what good teaching is. And I really recommend that work of James G. if you're interested in kind of following up on that. He's in a place called Arizona, where I'm from. Has anyone ever been to Arizona? It's a horrible place.
I have been to Tempe, so I mean, I can't say much.
That's where I grew up. It's terrible, isn't it?
Well, I was at ASU, so again, I was at a college campus. I can't really. I've learned never to judge the U.S. by college campuses because it's a whole different thing.
That's very wise. Yeah, college campuses are sort of the best example of what we can do, but not the most representative, I guess.
That's true. Are there any other questions or? Laura.
I want to know if there's any consensus in the U.S. nowadays, in 2019, 18, from schools or teachers, associations of teachers that are using Graphica in classrooms, primary school and high school. I know that the U.S. is huge, but is there any kind of general more acceptance of it?
Do you hear the question, Dave?
Raul, could you repeat it for me?
Yeah, so the question basically is if there is any sort of consensus or some kind of agreement across schools or professional organizations about the inclusion of graphica and comics in.
I don't know that there's an official statement, but the way that organizations like the Literacy Research Association and the National Council for the Teachers of English have been going, they're definitely moving towards saying that Graphica is a valid form of text. But that doesn't, in the US, always mean that teachers are on board with that. Sometimes researchers and teachers who are at the forefront of things are much more, I guess, liberal, progressive, but what happens in classrooms can lag behind for a bit here. So I oftentimes, when I'm working with teachers in the US, they'll say, I really want to use Graphica, but I don't think the principal at my school will be okay with that. I think the parents won't understand what's valuable here. Do you have any resources that you can offer me? So I do. There are a number of websites that offer really good justifications for using individual comic book texts. Like if you wanted to teach a certain thing, you could find justification. And if it's a larger justification, we have things like the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which sends resources to teachers that they can share with parents. Let me see, I might have something right here behind me on my bookshelf. So this came out from the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and it's raising a reader, how comics and graphic novels can help your kids love to read. And they were giving this out for free. So I would look up the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund on the internet, and you can find all sorts of justifications there that talk about how reading comic books helps children learn to read, period, how it works with language learners specifically. And there's a lot of good research out there, but unfortunately, I think research is sometimes written for other researchers rather than for teachers. And so I think some of the arguments haven't necessarily made their way out into the world as much as we'd like them to. But thank you for your question.
Folks, any other questions? Don't be shy. Don't be afraid. We can translate the question. We can read the question again. So don't be shy. Well, what they're thinking, Dave. I have a question.
Yeah.
Because we have talked. I mean, the presentation have talked a lot about reading comics, but you and I both know that literacy is a horse and carriage thing, where you cannot conceive reading without writing.
Right.
So therein goes my question. How can we start making the transition from just reading comics and graphica to start having our students write comics and graphica?
And this is super interesting to me as well, because writing comic books is tremendously difficult. And a lot of my students that I work with, they see themselves as bad artists. And they say, I'm not very good at drawing. All I can draw is a stick figure, and therefore I don't want to do this. And I said, well, the way a lot of comic books get made is that one person writes the script, and then they find someone to draw their comic book for them, and it's a process. They're constantly communicating and saying, this is how I imagine it looking, and then the artist says, well, this is how I imagine it looking. So it's a collaboration, which is something we're always trying to teach to our children, our young people, is how to work together. But teaching young people to make comic books in some ways means teaching them about art history and art theory, why you would use a close-up on somebody's face instead of showing them at a distance, why you would use a bird's eye view instead of a worm's eye view, why you would choose to use color or black and white. And so I've done a lot of work with young people writing their stories through comic books, and almost all of them tell me it's harder than I thought it was going to be. So one place that you can start is by going online and just typing in blank comics panels, and you'll be given all of these sheets that have different layouts of panels. Some of them might just be like 6 boxes on a page. Others might have, a mix of circles and rectangles. And you make these available to children so that they don't have to design their own page. And then you say, it's time to develop a story. And before you start drawing it, you probably want to write a script for yourself. What happens here? What happens there? And it also means talking to children about how do you use the spaces in between the panels to make the reader form inferences. Because, oftentimes really good comics leave a lot up to the interpretation of the reader. And so we want children who are making their own comics to do that too, to not just tell us everything. So I always use examples with children and say, one thing that a bad comic book does is it shows us and it tells us at the same time. So, if you draw a picture of a sunrise, you don't then include the words, there was a sunrise, because it's redundant that way. But what you can do with comics is screw with the reader's interpretation by showing the sun rising and then including words like, it was the middle of the night, because then as the reader, we're like, huh? The thing that I'm reading and the thing that I'm seeing are contradicting each other. And what's going on now? So as soon as you've done that to your reader, you kind of hook them. You've got them, and you can take them on a journey and play games with them. And one of the things that I really love seeing kids do when they make their own comic books, I think I mentioned I work with transnational immigrant and refugee children here, is a lot of children want to tell their stories, but they feel like it's dangerous to do that, because of the way that immigration is talked about in the United States, especially with the current president we have. Children don't feel comfortable saying, I'm from this country and I came here this way. So oftentimes they'll use images and symbols to carry bits of their story without directly saying something. And it's really quite powerful to see them do that. One character of mine, sorry, not character, one student of mine created a character who was walking through the desert. And, he told me it's all very symbolic of how his family came to the United States. But in the story, they fight a ghost and they do all of this kind of supernatural stuff that didn't happen to him literally, but to him, it felt like he was telling his immigration experience. And so the fact that he felt like comics could help him do that and do it justice, I find that profound and powerful. So thank you, Dr. Mora. I love asking young people to make comics. And some don't want to tell stories like that. Some want to make up their own Batman story, and that's fine too. There's room for all of it.
I mean, I want to continue writing with this because I really like the part where you pointed out truth, that comics are collaborative, are an exercise in collaborative writing, in the sense that there is someone who writes the script and someone who does the comics, but even in the sense of even you have different people, they still have to talk to each other.
Yeah.
It's not like I simply write the drawing, draw the stuff, and then now start putting dialogue in it because it's not going to work. So I think even even if you had students collaborating in comics, there would be so much conversation that they would really feed off of each other in order to learn to write better.
That's true. There's a lot. And one of the things that I've seen lately in professional comics is back in the day, you would buy one, and on the credits page, it would say, so-and-so was the writer, so-and-so was the artist, so-and-so was the colorist. And a lot of the time now, it just lists all of their name, and it says storytellers.
Uh-huh.
And I like that a lot, because it kind of says, well, they're all telling the story together. And all of them are necessary to do that. You can't really tell the story without the words or without the pictures. I've seen students work really well together telling a story, and I've seen children get in fights with each other because they're like, that's not how I wanted it to look. And the artist is like, yeah, it's how I wanted it to look. And the author says, but this was my idea. It has to look the way I want it to look. And so they're negotiating power roles, and it's tricky. But I think it's good for them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because I think, especially because group work, and we have talked about this in the class, that sometimes students work in groups, it doesn't mean they know how to work as a group. And I think that's the thing we have to discuss, that we have students work in groups, but not as a group, and I think that's a huge difference. And I think even introducing something like comics can teach them to work as a group. It says that there is something negotiation about, but there has to be conversation. It's not simply split tasks across people and then try to cut and paste it together at the end.
That's right. Everyone has a unique role in this kind of collaboration.
Folks, any can you come a little closer? Because the microphone is right here. Where's the camera? Yeah, right here.
Hey.
Hello. I'm Juan.
Hi.
I wanted to, when we talk about working in groups and everyone taking roles, think about social constructivism.
Social constructivism?
So is there like any supportive theory on your job and what you're doing? Because I want to know.
Yeah, thank you for your question. There are a lot of theories that do kind of underpin the work that I'm doing that I haven't really talked about. One of the biggest is sort of that literacy is a social practice, that even when we do it individually by ourselves, late at night in our room, there's a Russian scholar from early in the 20th century, Bakhtin, who talked about all communication is social because we're taking the words of somebody else and we're reinterpreting them to make meaning ourselves. And so all of the work that I do is built on this idea that literacy is relational. And oftentimes when you watch the way children come together to talk about what they're doing with these comic books, it allows them to build up their social worlds. I'm going to recommend another book now. So this is somebody from Dr. Mora's Ph.D. school, Anne Haas Dyson, and she writing superheroes, contemporary childhood, popular culture, and classroom literacy. And so many of the stories from this book are about children who would go out and play on the playground and tell superhero stories, even if it was just chasing each other around and saying, I'm Batman and you're the Joker, we're fighting now. But it's all built, her work is built on Bakhtinian social theory that this is not work that happens in our brains, it's work that happens in these social webs between people. Well, thank you for asking me. No one ever asked me about the theory.
No, and I think it's important because, I think it's very important that, and I contextualize a little bit where this is coming from anyway, that we are trying to work with specialist teachers into understanding that there are theories that should inform their practice, that their practice is not something isolated from theoretical constructs, and even if they don't know all the names and all the theories, they have to understand that they need to look at to inform their practice and to actually make it better. So I think,
Absolutely.
Where you see where it comes from, what are the theorists? I think that's an important question that I really hope all our students start asking everybody that interacting with at a professional level. I mean, I'm talking about university professors, I'm talking about professional development seminars, going to a conference, demanding that people tell them what's under the hood, so to speak. Tell them, okay, who are the people, what are the theories, what are the schools of thought that inform your work? So I think the question is very relevant, and I appreciate that you went into the detail of answering the question.
Thank you. And this is something I talk to my students about too, who are working to become teachers, which is that everything we do as teachers is built on theory, even if we don't recognize the theory. When my teachers talk about a student being a good student or a bad student, like, what theories are you using to determine that? Is it that the good student writes in a certain way or reads in a certain way? Because that's based on theories that we hold about what good writing is or what good reading looks like. And it's not until we become aware of those theories that we're able to break out of those habits and realize oftentimes the theories we carry around with us exclude people, and they create hierarchies where some learners are left out and other learners are privileged because they maybe possess more traditional styles. So yeah, I think it's unbelievably important for all of us all the time to be reflecting on what are the theories that drive us, what do we see as knowledge, what do we see as intelligence, what do we see as engagement, and then to try to widen our lenses and say, knowledge can look like all sorts of things. An engaged child can look all sorts of different ways. A good kid isn't just a kid who sits quietly. A good kid might be one that gets labeled disruptive, but it doesn't make them not good when we examine our own theories of practice.
We have another question, Dave.
Great.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is David.
Oh, good name.
Talking about children, like how can you enforce those attitudes, like to tell them about their stories, about their thoughts, like about their the superheroes they want to be, like, because I work with children and sometimes they have many stories. They even write their own songs, but they are afraid to show them because they feel that I'm going to judge them because maybe, I don't know, some sort of religion, or I'm going to judge.
Um, Good question. I think a lot of it depends on the attitude and the culture that you develop with these children throughout an entire year. One of the things that I would try to do a lot as a teacher is embarrass myself. And I know that sounds a little weird, but when I made sure that my students saw that I could write something bad and read it out loud, it kind of it chips away at the armor a little bit. You say, this is the kind of environment that we want to build together. This is the culture of our classroom where we are not afraid to take risks and do things publicly. But it's not always easy because oftentimes children will laugh at other children and it can make them feel bad. But I do think it's important for teachers to show that I don't always know the answer. I'm okay humiliating myself sometimes. If I'm asking children to write a song, I'll write a song too, and I'll sing it. I'll sing it, and I'll forget the words, and I'll sound horrible, but it's okay. And not every child wants to tell superhero stories. Some children might want to write songs or play with a Barbie or a My Little Pony. And my suggestion here is not that comic books are the answer, but all that other stuff isn't. It's that we need to look at the things that children use to grow their imaginations and try to incorporate that into our teaching and show children that we respect the things that they value. Right now, it just happens that comic books and superheroes are kind of popular across the world, but they won't always be. Does that make sense, David?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it helped a lot.
Yeah. So, just make sure you embarrass yourself in front of the children and things will be okay. It's maybe not that simple, but it's all about building that community together. Hi.
How do we bring together the best of both worlds? Because sometimes in our schools, they're going to ask us to read classical books and classical novels or storytelling by Danish people. And we want to bring this comic and video game thing. So how do we conjugate those things?
Yeah. I think a lot of it depends on context of the school, and I don't know the context of the schools in Medellin very well, but I would say you need to work within and against the system. So if the system is saying you need to only teach this, you can't just say, I'm going to disregard and ignore that completely. I'm going to teach only the things that I care about. But you also can't say, I'm just going to follow the system line by line by line. We find room in the curriculum to add something here and to spend a little time there. And so I guess it's not radical in the way that you say, well, I'm just going to completely ignore the standards that are given to me by the school. Because if we do that, we usually don't stay at that school for very long. But finding small areas where we can be subversive with the curriculum and add in things that young people care about is a pretty good start. And so sometimes that happens after school or at lunch. Sometimes it happens directly in the school day. But one of the most important things that I think teachers can do is be able to justify why you're doing something. So if your principal or your boss or a parent says, why are you teaching my child, using video games instead of using Gabriel Garcia Marquez short story? You need to be able to explain why you're doing that. Because, if you can't justify it, people will say, then why did you do it?
I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Actually, about what my partner was saying. It's just that in many schools there's still like a discrimination against those activities, and the students are not used to those as well. So, for example, I have seen that my students, they're not used to create knowledge. They are used to develop activities. So sometimes you have a workshop, work together, get a grade, go, and every day it's the same until a test comes out. But I have told them to elaborate stories, to create their own life, even if it's just so simple and it sounds ridiculous. And it is difficult for them because they are used to what they have to do. So it's a time where the teacher has to make them actually think and do instead of just developing.
Yeah, I think a lot of this involves inviting children to join you in doing something new and saying, I know that you're used to school being like this, but I want to invite you to try something new with me. And I don't know exactly how it's going to go, but I want to use different kinds of text, and I want to invite you to think in different kinds of ways. And you might even say, there's not going to be a grade attached to this. This is an experiment we're going to do where we're going to tell stories, and I'm not going to judge the stories you come up with. You're not going to get a letter grade on it. And it's not going to be our entire day. It's just going to be a little part of our day. Children, will you come with me and do this thing? And I wonder what they would say. Some of them might feel a little weird about it. Like, well, no, I'm used to school being this thing where, everything is regimented and graded. But I'm guessing some of them would feel really freed by you inviting them to participate in something a little bit different for part of the day. Even if it was 20 minutes or 30 minutes once a week. Say, this is going to be our time away from school as usual. Do you think the children would be receptive to that?
Yeah. A lot.
Maybe. I know children in America are sick of taking tests. So much of our curriculum here is geared towards high stakes testing. It's kind of disgusting.
Yeah, that we have a similar drive here, and I agree. Sometimes we need to move away from that and get into what really matters in terms of what we're teaching and what our students are doing with language. And sometimes just taking a test is not necessarily the ultimate goal that we should be striving for in our educational system.
Right. It's part of school, and it will continue to be a part of school, but when you think about what the real purpose of school is, it's children's learning. And tests aren't the same thing as learning. And there's so many different ways for children to learn and to show us what they're learning. And I think it's important for there to be numerous mechanisms for them to have different outlets.
Any other questions? Oh,
What
well,
about
can you come a little closer? Because if you get close enough, we can hear the microphone, but far it's a little difficult.
What about people with special needs? That sometimes we have people, deaf people, or with autism. So how can we apply this kind of activities?
Yeah.
I actually didn't hear the main part of the question. How can we apply?
The question is that, how can we apply this when we're working with students with special needs, like students or have etc.
I actually think we can apply this with students with special needs almost identically. A lot of children with special needs already read comic books and go to see superhero movies, and a lot of it depends on what the needs of the children are. And as their teacher, you already are more able to speak to that than I am. But when I've had students in the United States, we would say students with disabilities who have like an IEP, an individualized education plan. Oftentimes, they're absolutely ready to participate 100% in lessons with comics, and oftentimes they're able to see themselves in a more affirming light than through a traditional curriculum. A lot of my students with special needs, when they look at comics and make comics, end up seeing themselves as big, strong students, which pushes a counter narrative to the one that's put on them by the school a lot of the time. I was reading an article just a few weeks ago about this, how a student who was traditionally got bad grades in school and was pulled out of class for special education, during a comic book unit, he was able to see himself as the strongest kid in the class, and other students saw him as the strongest as well. So it let him write a different story about his own identity. It was really cool.
Any final thoughts? Any final questions? Not then, because we agreed to kind of an hour, and it's already past the time is almost coming to an end. First, I think we should give our good friend Dr. Lowe a round of applause. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for hosting me today. It was really a pleasure and a privilege.
Pleasure was ours. I mean, I've known David's work for a few years already, and I knew he was going to come up with some really good ideas for you on Demo Wednesday, on Demo Friday and Wednesday. I definitely look forward to more of the work that we'll be doing, at least in the Literacy and Second Language project. We're still doing some work with David, especially as we are looking at the comics in the city and comics in language instruction. As you said, I look forward to seeing you at ARA in a few days.
Yay!
I mean,
well, travel safely.
We have that CDL, that Critical Digital Literacy panel together anyway. We just hang out either way. So again, my gratitude for your time, for your wisdom, for taking the students' questions to the students who tackled and came up with such interesting questions. Thank you for making this a more interactive experience. For the ones in my class, I'll see you on Friday for the work. For the ones in Noah's class, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And have a very good rest of the day. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.